Now this naming of a range is very, very handy, because what you can do is things like this. If you wanted to use a sum function like we did here, this sum function uses this range that we call the list of num. So instead of specifying the range in the formula, you can just write the name of the range you've defined. So if I write sum list of num, it will calculate the sum over this range that we called list of num. And you can see it's the same as doing it this way. So up here in the formula bar, you can see this one is calculating A2 to A40, whereas this is just over list of num. Since we defined the list of num to be A2 to A40, we get the same list. You can see it visually by double-clicking on it, that it is in fact the same range. So very handy. Again, in order to do it, all you have to do is select the range you want and type in the name right up here. You can do that to a single cell as well, although that's not as useful. Usually more useful to do it over a range. And these ranges last over or carry over to different worksheets as well. So if you go to sheet 4, and if I want to do the sum here of list of num, I can just as easily write it down, and I get 2062 yet again. So let's use our handy list of nums and calculate the max. So we go in here. Again, the max function is also just max, and we type in the list of num. And we get 100. 100 is the max in this one. So don't forget to notice the syntax to write the functions. It's just an equal sign followed by the name of the function, followed by open brackets, then the inputs to the function, then a close bracket. And if there are many inputs that are defined separately, then just add a comma. What I mean there is if you have sum, if you want to take the sum of just the first two numbers, or let's just say you want to take the sum of the number 4 and the number 6, you write 4 comma 6, close brackets, enter, you get 10. So don't get confused on the syntax. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so let me introduce to you a couple of other functions that will help us use the COUNTIF function. That's the last one left out. Before we get to it though, let's take a look at the rand between function. So the rand between, you can click here to kind of read a little bit about it, and you can go into the help and it'll give you a lot about it. But what the rand between function does is that it gives you a random number between the bottom and the top number that you specify. So if you take a look here, it prompts you with the bottom and a top. So let's say we want the bottom number to be 0 and the top number to be 1. So it'll give us a random number between 0 and 1. And in this case, it just gave us 1. So let's copy this down so it's associated with everything. If you see here, this number has changed from 1 to 0. And that's because it recalculated. And every time you change anything in Excel, the spreadsheet gets recalculated. So if you have a random number, you have to be careful because every time you do anything, that number will change. So let's do this. So in this case, we're only going to get 0 or 1 because the rand between gives you integers. So, and that is okay. Let's just copy it all the way down, and we have a whole bunch of zeros and ones. Now, our goal is to count the number of numbers in a list of numbers, or list of num, that correspond to a 1 and not to a 0. The problem we'll face though is every time we do it, we'll get a different number because the random numbers will change. Let me demonstrate with the COUNTIF function. So with COUNTIF, let's type it in here. COUNTIF requires a range to add over, or sorry, COUNTIF requires a range to count. So let's give it this range that we just defined next to list of nums with the range between. So just scroll up to the top, and it requires a criteria. So you provide it with a criteria, and if the criteria is met, it will count that cell, and if it's not met, it won't count it. So our criteria is simply the number 1, because we want it to be equal to the number 1. And we close the brackets and hit enter. So there are 19 of them, but that 19 of ones here. But let's do it again. And now we have 21. And if we do it again, we have 16. This is of course happening because the rand numbers keep changing every time. So every time we hit enter, it recalculates all of the rand numbers here, and they turn out to be different every time. So we don't want that to happen. So to remedy that, you should select all of the ones that you have here and copy the whole range and paste it, but not just paste it, paste the values. You can do it here, or if your version of Excel doesn't have these little buttons here, you can go to paste special and it will also have it there. And you do values. Now you can see the formulas have just been replaced by the values. Over here used to be the rand between, now it's gone, now we just have the values. And 16 is constant. So if you do it again, it'll always be 16. So there is a trick to copying formulas, as you see. There is the relative referencing, which happens when you don't use the dollar signs. Absolute referencing when you use dollar signs. And you can also just copy the values of the formulas instead of copying entire formulas. This is handy when you know that you won't need to recalculate those formulas ever. It saves the disk space that the Excel file uses, and it saves the computational workload because it doesn't have to recalculate. So your Excel will be just a tiny bit faster every time you use it if you don't have that many formulas. And if you use values instead of the formulas, if you really don't need the formulas there anymore. But the other star here is the COUNTIF function. Unlike all of the other functions, where they just took in a value and produced an output, COUNTIF took in a range of values and also took in a conditional in order to calculate its output. The conditional was that the value that it's counting has to be equal to 1. Now, we can just as easily do another COUNTIF here with list of num, no, not with list of num, sorry, with this one here, and with 0. So it'll count all of the ones that are 0. Now, we have 39 numbers and 16 of them are 1. So we expect 23 of them to be zeros, and it is 23. Perfect. Now there is a more sophisticated function that I want to introduce, which is called the SUMIF function. The way the SUMIF function works is it works almost exactly the same as COUNTIF, but with one difference. If you see here, it has 3 different inputs: range, criteria, and then sum range. What it's basically saying is you can have a range on one range and sum a different range. Let me illustrate. So for range, we just want these numbers again. For criteria, we want it to be equal to 1. But for sum range, we want to use the list of numbers here. We could have also typed in list of num, and it's just converted to list of num anyway. But we can also use that. Now, it will sum every number in list of 1 as long as the adjacent column has a 1 in it. And we get 720. So now this function has taken 3 inputs. One input works as the conditional, and the other input is meant to actually compute whatever the function is meant to compute, which is a sum in this case. And there's also an average if function, which is just identical to sum if. Just the difference is it calculates the average. Let me illustrate. We write average if. Again, we give it the criteria here, the range here, sorry. The criteria we say is 1, and the average range we give it the list of num. List of num. And we get 45 is the average, 720 is the sum. Okay, so we looked at a bunch of different functions. Some functions like min, max, sum, and average, they just take up a range and they compute some statistic or something on that range, while others, such as COUNTIF, take up a range and a conditional and do something based on that conditional. This is important to realize. It is doing something, in which in this case is counting, but something, it is doing something based on the conditional given here, conditional 1. SUMIF consumes a range, which is this one. Let's double click it. So it consumes the range, which is here in blue, and another list of numbers in green, which you can see the top of over here. Make it a bit easier to see by inserting another column here. So the SUMIF, there are two ranges, list of numbers and this one, those zeros and ones. Now SUMIF consumes one range and a conditional that works upon the first range, but it does something, it computes something, which in this case is a sum, but it computes something on a different range. So again, there are two ranges involved. The zeros in one range, which let me call this actually conditional. This is the conditional range, and we have the list of numbers. So it consumes the conditional and a condition, which in this case is given here as 1, and a list of numbers to compute something on, which in this case is sum. Again, average works the same way. It consumes the conditional range, uses the condition 1 and applies it to the conditional range, and then does something on the list of numbers, which in this case is compute the average of list of numbers. So this is very important, this if that is happening here. Because if the conditional is equal to 1, then compute the sum or the average of the number associated with the 1 in this range. So this one here equals this 63 here. This 63 is what will get included in the SUMIF and average if functions, given that since there is a 1 here. This 69 won't get included because there is a 0 here. This 42 will not get included because there's a 0, whereas this 0 will get included because there is a 1 here. Make sense? Good. So I hope you understand how important the concept of if and of conditionals is in Excel and in computer programming in general. But if is so important that Excel offers a dedicated if function. So let's see how that works. So the function is just if Then you have a conditional, and if the conditional is true, one value, and if it's false, another. So if you can take a look here, you have a logical test, a value if true, and a value if false. So let's actually insert a column here. So let's write if, let's test the conditional column again. So we can say if this cell is equal to 0, then print 0 otherwise, which is the last value in this if statement, print not 0. So let's take a look at the if function before we hit enter. So what we're doing here is, in the first value, we have a comparison. We're comparing C2, this cell right here, with the number 0, and with using an equal to sign. So if it is equal, we'll get a true, otherwise we'll get a false. If we get a true, then the second value in the if statement will be activated and we'll get a 0. If we get a false, then the third value in the if statement will be activated and we'll get a not 0. And in this case we get a 0, and if we drag this down all the way, we get zeros corresponding to zeros and 1 and not 0 corresponding to all the ones. This happened again because in this cell it compared C12 to 0. So it said, is 1 equal to 0? And the answer was false. So it went to not 0. So one way to think about it is as if, then, else. So this is if this is true, then this, else this. If is the first one, then this, if it is true, then use the second value in the formula. And if it is false or else, use the not 0 or the third value in the formula. And this is how the if statement works, or the if formula works in Excel. So let me label this column as well as if demo.